So in that gospel reading I just read from Matthew chapter 1, we hear Jesus tell a very pointed parable, pointy even. In Jesus' parable there is a vineyard, and it's farmed by tenants, by renters. And they are rebellious tenants who refuse to pay the rent. But the owner that Jesus describes is incredibly patient about this. First, he sends some servants to collect his part of the harvest, and the tenants, well, they attack these servants and even murder one of them. Now, if it was us, we'd call out the riot police at this point. But the owner doesn't do that, does he? He actually sends more servants. And the tenants, well, they do the same thing to them they did to the first group. And finally, and Jesus is very pointed about this finally. We might also translate it last of all, or last chance. Finally, the owner sends his own son, saying, they will respect my son. But the tenants, they are like Joseph's 11 brothers in Genesis 37. They do not respect the son. In fact, they say exactly the same thing Joseph's brothers did when they encountered him alone in the wilderness. Let us kill him. Clearly, the tenants' evil knows no bounds. Jesus says that these tenants, they murder the son after throwing him out of the vineyard with the misguided hope that if the heir to the vineyard is dead, well, then it will be theirs forever. But this is not actually what will happen. Far from it. Even the priests and elders who Jesus is talking to, this whole conversation takes place in Holy Week in the temple itself. They know it. They say in verse 41 that the owner of this vineyard will now put those wretches to a miserable death. He's been merciful, but there are limits. So to recap, in Jesus' parable we just heard from Matthew 21, the vineyard renters, the vineyard tenants, they want it all for themselves, and they are even willing to murder for it. But they get nothing in the end. Worse than that, they get killed. They get death in the end. You would not have wanted to be the people that Jesus is talking about in this parable, would you? Not only are these renters terrible people, not just guilty of dodging the rent, but also of repeated murder, they are also ultimately going to go down in flames themselves. And you know, the people, the priests and the elders in particular in the temple who heard Jesus tell this parable, they knew who he was talking about. They knew he was talking about them. Israel's the vineyard, and they, the leaders, the chief priests and the elders, well, they are the tenants. To start with, Israel is repeatedly described as a vineyard in the Old Testament. We heard a couple of examples of that this morning. Isaiah chapter 5, verse 7 just says it outright. It says, "For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel." And Psalm 80 also uses a vineyard as an image for Israel, saying of verse 8 of God, "You brought a vine out of Egypt, and you have cast out the nations and planted it in Israel, in the vineyard." As an aside, it's interesting to me the ways that Psalm 80 was repurposed during the time of the Reformation. Roman Catholic counter-reformers made it into a prayer for God's intervention on their side of that struggle. As they saw it, the Roman Catholic Church was the vineyard, and Martin Luther himself was the wild boar out of the woods, from verse 13. Now, I suspect Luther didn't mind too much being called a wild boar. He could be a bit boorish, if you'll let me get away with a really cheap pun this morning. But I wonder if the counter-reformers totally thought through claiming the vineyard metaphor for their own, seeing how Jesus himself describes it in Matthew 21, how God will deal with bad tenants, with bad leaders. But back to Matthew 21. We know that Jesus was really talking about Israel's leaders, the high priests and the elders, when he refers to the tenants because of how they respond, right? It says in verse 46 that they heard this parable, and immediately after that, they weren't saying, well, that's an interesting story. No. They were seeking to arrest him right then and there. And this can only be a response of people who know they are not just spectators, but actually have a part in the story that they just heard. And not only a part, but not a complimentary part. But oh, the irony, right? Jesus, in his parable, basically calls them bullies and murderers. And instead of saying, well, that's not us, they attempt to prove him right there, by trying to seize him in the temple. Their behavior, it just strengthens Jesus' point. It strengthens his pointy parable. Israel's leaders, he is saying, have a long track record of treating God's messengers terribly. Israel's always been God's vineyard, but yet when God has sent his servants, and Jesus means particularly the prophets here, to collect the produce, that is, to call God's people to keep the covenant, to keep their agreement with God about how they will worship and how they will live. More often than not, they have been ignored, or worse, murdered. 1 Kings 18 describes the queen of Israel, Jezebel, murdering the prophets by the dozens. And the prophet Jeremiah, just to name one specific messenger of God, is imprisoned and beaten and thrown into a well. Shades of the Joseph story again from Genesis 37. Thrown into a well by Israel's king in Jeremiah 37 and 38. The leaders of Israel, well, they consistently seem to want to cut God out of his own vineyard and keep its fruit for themselves alone. Worse, Jesus is saying that they will go so far as to kill the final, the last of all messenger, God's Son. But remember, in the end, the tenants are the ones who lose. Jesus says he will be vindicated in this parable. He says in verse 44, and the one who falls on this stone, Jesus, the cornerstone, will be broken to pieces. And when it falls on anyone, it will crush him. Now, I hope spending some time unpacking this parable in some detail this morning has been interesting. But maybe you're wondering, what does this have to do with us, Peter, right here and now, today? I mean, we aren't Israel. Our leaders aren't high priests and elders. Isn't everything that Jesus is speaking about here in the past? Well, of course, yes. In a very real way, this parable has been completely fulfilled. God is the owner. Israel is the vineyard. The chief priests and elders, the tenants. And Jesus himself is the final messenger from God, the last of all Son. And the chief priests and the elders, well, they did exactly what Jesus said they would, right? They rejected him. They arrested him. They murdered him. Just like Jesus says they murdered the prophets before him. And shortly after, just as Jesus said, the kingdom of God will be taken from you and given to people producing its fruits. And that's what happened too. The whole basis of the chief priests and elders' power and religious authority, the temple, well, it's destroyed by the Romans. And many of these same high priests and elders were murdered, were killed in the carnage of the great Jewish revolt. And then a new people of God, the church, made up of both Jews and Gentiles who followed Jesus. Well, they're now an expanded vineyard, so to speak. And since then, the church has just gone along happily, doing its thing. We go from strength to strength, never getting anything wrong, and always having leaders we can rely on to keep this expanded vineyard and pay our rent on time to God. Right? Or not. In fact, the truth is that just like the old Israel, we have had our own robber baron priests and corrupt elders. Jesus himself would not be safe at some times and in some places in the church. And you know, one of the most powerful pictures, at least to me, of the church's potential for failure comes from a modern parable from the Russian author Fyodor Dostoevsky in his novel, The Brothers Karamazov. He describes in it a grand inquisitor of the Spanish Inquisition, a low point in church history if there ever was one, talking with Jesus Christ in a dungeon. In the story, Jesus has been captured by the Inquisition near Seville after doing the same sort of disorderly things he does in the Gospels. Particularly, he raises a little girl, a dead little girl, to life in the middle of her funeral on the cathedral steps. The institutional church, the Grand Inquisitor tells Jesus as he's locked in the dungeon, the institutional church doesn't want that sort of Jesus anymore. In fact, long ago it abandoned him for the devil, the wise spirit, quote unquote, of death and destruction. The devil, he offers power. The devil, he offers control. How can Jesus' freedom and forgiveness compete with that? The Grand Inquisitor tells Jesus, he says, "We are not with you, but with him. And that is our secret. For centuries we have abandoned you to follow him." Sometimes the Grand Inquisitor and Dostoevsky's parable claim, well, it rings true, much to our shame and sadness. Friends, even today, we must always remain careful. The lure of pursuing power instead of following Jesus still sings its siren song over the vineyard. The church and its leaders, the new tenants in the vineyard, so to speak, have shown again and again they are not immune. One of the gravest mistakes we can make when reading the Bible is to assume that we are naturally better than the people being described, even the bad people. Or to put it another way, just because we are the new Israel, the expanded vineyard, well, it doesn't mean we aren't the old Israel too. I was reminded of this over the past week as news about yet another major Christian leader caught in abusive behavior came out. I won't dwell on the details, in part because there's things about this situation that are not yet known. But I will say that it has sometimes been hard for us as Christians and as church leaders to look the truth straight in the face. And the truth is that these problems and leadership failures, well, they aren't just going to go away. And they were more common in the past than we wish were true. Though sometimes they've been better hidden than today. Friends, they will be with us always, and we will always have to fight against them. Because church leaders and church members, just like the chief priests and the elders of Jesus' day, well, are people And people aren't either good or bad, depending on whether or not they are Christians or what position they hold in the hierarchy. But both good and bad. And sometimes that dark spirit of death and destruction wins. So what do we do? What do we do? First, expect from leaders of the church what the Bible commands. I've talked about this before, but 1 Timothy chapter 3 gives us a great picture of that. Church leaders, it says, should be above reproach. They should be sober-minded and self-controlled and respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not a drunkard, not violent but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. It goes on, but let me encourage you to read it for yourself. At the same time, have a bit of mercy. Church leaders, just like everyone else, are going to fall down from time to time. In Jesus' parable this morning, God himself shows great mercy, responding not once but twice to the violent rejection of his messengers, not with fire or sword, not with the riot police that we would be tempted to send in, but by sending someone else. But finally, don't let that mercy for leaders as humans, for that matter, your appreciation for a particular leader's teaching or charisma or good work, cause you to accept and excuse things you know would be wrong if you did them, or if someone you liked less did them. Christian leaders, tenants, renters over the expanded vineyard of the church, well, they need accountability along with mercy. Friends, the Son came once to the vineyard. His rejection by the high priests and the elders of his time caused a cataclysm, a great turning over. And that turning over opened the gates of God's vineyard to the likes of us. I don't remember where Paul says it, but he says, if the unbelief of the Jews caused salvation for all, what will their belief cause? We are now responsible for tending the crop, not just for ourselves, but for the true owner, God, his last of all Son, is coming again to collect his due. Amen.